On the morning of October 17th, 1979, at approximately 9:43 a.m., a middle-aged man carrying a brown leather briefcase entered the main reading room of the Library of Congress on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. His name was Viktor Sergeyevich Volkov, and he was listed in official records as a cultural attaché at the Soviet mission to the United Nations. He was 47 years old, married with 2 teenage daughters, and had been living in New York City for nearly 4 years. According to FBI surveillance logs that would later become part of the evidentiary record in a federal espionage case, Volkov spent approximately 11 minutes inside the library that morning before exiting through the main entrance, carrying a different briefcase, identical in appearance to the one he had brought in, but containing materials that would ultimately expose one of the most damaging intelligence breaches of the late Cold War period. The man who left the library 14 minutes after Volkov, carrying the original brown briefcase, was named Thomas Edward Garrett. He was 52 years old, a senior analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency specializing in Soviet military capabilities, and he had been providing classified information to Soviet intelligence for 7 years. By the time both men reached their respective destinations that October morning, a surveillance team of 9 FBI agents had documented the exchange from 4 different vantage points using both still photography and motion picture cameras. The resulting investigation would not only lead to Garrett's arrest and conviction, but would also reveal the extent to which an ordinary government employee, motivated by a complex mixture of ideology, resentment, and financial need, could compromise national security while maintaining the appearance of loyal service. Thomas Garrett had grown up in Pittsburgh, the son of a steelworker who had been injured in an industrial accident in 1945 and spent the remainder of his working life in chronic pain. Garrett attended the University of Pittsburgh on a partial scholarship, studying history and political science, and graduated in 1949 with decent but unremarkable grades. He had served 2 years in the Army during the Korean War, working in intelligence analysis at a base in Japan, and had returned to civilian life in 1953 with a skill set that made him employable in the expanding national security apparatus of the 1950s. He joined the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1961, shortly after its creation, and spent the next decade working his way up through the ranks of Soviet military analysts. By 1972, when Garrett was first approached by Soviet intelligence, he was earning $23.400 per year, a respectable middle-class salary, but one that felt inadequate given his level of education, his specialized expertise, and the 60-hour work weeks that his position demanded. He lived with his wife, Janet, and their 3 children in a modest 3-bedroom house in Arlington, Virginia. Janet worked part-time as a secretary at a local elementary school. They had 2 cars, both several years old, and struggled with the same financial pressures that affected many middle-class families in the 1970s: rising costs, stagnant wages, children approaching college age, a mortgage that never seemed to shrink as fast as it should. The initial contact occurred on a Friday evening in June 1972 in the parking lot of a shopping center in Falls Church, Virginia. A man approached Garrett and asked for directions to a nearby street. The man was Eastern European, spoke with a noticeable accent, and after Garrett provided the directions, engaged him in casual conversation about the shopping center, the neighborhood, and eventually about what Garrett did for work. The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes. The man thanked him and walked away. Garrett thought nothing of it. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon, the same man approached Garrett outside a drugstore in Arlington where Garrett had stopped to pick up a prescription. This time the man identified himself only as Peter and said he worked for an organization that was interested in promoting better understanding between the United States and the Soviet Union. He asked if Garrett might be willing to provide some information about American defense policies. Nothing classified, Peter emphasized, just general background about how decisions were made, how the Defense Intelligence Agency operated, the kinds of analyses that were being produced. In exchange, Peter's organization would be willing to provide compensation for Garrett's time. Garrett's first reaction, he would later testify, was suspicion followed almost immediately by rationalization. He knew he was being recruited. He had received counterintelligence briefings. He understood that what was being proposed constituted espionage. But Peter had been careful in his approach. He had not explicitly identified himself as a Soviet intelligence officer. He had not immediately requested classified material, and Garrett, who had spent 11 years analyzing Soviet military capabilities and had developed what he considered to be a nuanced understanding of the geopolitical situation, found himself thinking that perhaps providing some general, unclassified background might not be such a terrible thing. If it could help reduce tensions, if it could prevent misunderstandings that might lead to conflict, wasn't there an argument that it served a larger good? The rationalization was, of course, exactly what his recruitment had been designed to produce. Soviet intelligence officers were trained to identify potential assets who combined access to valuable information with some form of vulnerability, financial pressure, career disappointment, ideological sympathy, or personal grievance, and to frame the initial approach in ways that allowed the target to convince themselves they were doing something reasonable, even noble. Garrett agreed to meet Peter again. At that second meeting, held in a park in Alexandria 2 weeks later, Garrett provided what he characterized as general background about DIA procedures. Peter gave him $500 in cash in an envelope. The recruitment was complete. Over the next 7 years, the relationship between Garrett and his Soviet handlers evolved through predictable stages. The requests for information became gradually more specific. The material he provided transitioned from unclassified background to documents that were marked confidential, then secret, then top secret. The compensation increased accordingly, eventually totaling approximately $180,000 over the course of the relationship, most of which Garrett deposited in small amounts and spent on ordinary family expenses over the years, declaring portions as consulting income on his tax returns to avoid arousing suspicion. Despite this additional money, the family continued to struggle financially because Garrett was careful not to alter their lifestyle in ways that might attract attention. The mechanics of the operation followed standard Soviet tradecraft protocols. Garrett would receive instructions through a system of signals, a chalk mark on a specific mailbox indicating that a meeting was scheduled, or the absence of such a mark indicating that it was safe to make a dead drop. For particularly sensitive material, he would meet his handler in person at locations throughout the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area and Northern Virginia. The meetings were brief, usually lasting no more than 10 to 15 minutes. Garrett would arrive carrying a briefcase. His handler would arrive separately carrying an identical briefcase. They would sit in proximity, place their briefcases on the ground, and after several minutes, each would pick up the other's case and depart. Garrett would leave with cash. The handler would leave with classified documents. By 1976, Garrett's handler was no longer Peter, but a new case officer named Viktor Volkov, who had arrived in New York as part of the Soviet mission to the United Nations, but traveled regularly to Washington under his diplomatic cover. Volkov was a career KGB officer, 44 years old at the time he took over Garrett's case, and had previously served in Vienna and Brussels. He spoke excellent English with only a slight accent. He was methodical, careful, and skilled at maintaining operational security. Under his management, Garrett's value as an asset increased significantly. Volkov encouraged him to focus on specific types of intelligence, particularly information about American understanding of Soviet weapons systems and military doctrine, and the quality of the material Garrett provided was, later damage assessments would conclude, consistently high. The investigation that would eventually lead to Garrett's exposure began not with any particular suspicion about him, but as part of a broader counterintelligence effort by the FBI to identify and surveil known or suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in the United States. By the late 1970s, the FBI had developed sophisticated surveillance capabilities and maintained extensive files on Soviet personnel assigned to diplomatic missions in New York, Washington, and elsewhere. Viktor Volkov had been identified as a probable intelligence officer based on his background, his pattern of travel, and various indicators that suggested his cultural attaché position was a cover assignment. In March 1979, the FBI initiated what was termed a limited surveillance operation on Volkov. The surveillance was not initially focused on any specific suspected activity, but was intended to document his movements, contacts, and patterns of behavior. The operation involved rotating teams of surveillance agents who would follow Volkov on days when he traveled to Washington or other locations outside New York. The surveillance was intermittent. The FBI did not have the resources to maintain constant coverage, but it was regular enough to begin establishing patterns. On July 12, 1979, surveillance agents documented Volkov meeting with an unidentified American male in a parking garage in Bethesda, Maryland. The two men were observed having a conversation that lasted approximately 8 minutes. No exchange of materials was observed. The American male was photographed but not immediately identified. On August 8th, Volkov was observed meeting the same man outside a shopping center in McLean, Virginia. Again, the meeting was brief. Again, no obvious exchange took place. The surveillance agents noted these contacts in their reports, but considered them inconclusive. The meetings could have been innocent. Volkov's cover position gave him legitimate reasons to interact with American citizens. Without additional evidence, the FBI could not justify a more intensive investigation. The breakthrough came on October 17th. The surveillance operation on that date was more extensive than usual because Volkov had traveled to Washington on a Tuesday. Unusual, since his previous trips had typically occurred on Fridays or weekends. A team of 9 agents was assigned to follow him. FBI records show that Volkov left the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue at 9:15 a.m., carrying a brown leather briefcase. He drove to Capitol Hill, parked his car in a public lot on Constitution Avenue, and walked to the Library of Congress. Special Agent Robert Chen, one of the surveillance agents positioned outside the library, later testified that he observed Volkov enter through the main entrance at 9:43 a.m. Another agent, Special Agent Margaret Hernandez, was positioned inside the library itself, posing as a researcher in the main reading room. She observed Volkov proceed directly to one of the long reading tables near the center of the ornate hall. He placed his briefcase on the floor beside his chair. He did not open it. He did not check out any books or request any materials from the reference desk. He sat for approximately 7 minutes, appearing to read a copy of the Washington Post that had been left on the table. Then he stood up, reached down, picked up a briefcase from under the table, and walked toward the exit. The briefcase he picked up was identical in appearance to the one he had placed on the floor, but it was not the same briefcase. While Volkov had been sitting at the table, another man had entered the main reading room, sat down at an adjacent position several feet away, placed his own brown leather briefcase on the floor near where Volkov's case was resting, opened a book, and after several minutes had closed the book, stood up and departed, taking Volkov's original briefcase with him. Special Agent Hernandez immediately radioed the rest of the surveillance team. Agents outside the library were instructed to photograph and follow the second man when he exited. At 9:57 a.m., the man emerged from the main entrance carrying the brown briefcase. Photographs taken at that moment would later be used to positively identify him as Thomas Edward Garrett, senior analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency. A team of agents followed him as he walked 4 blocks to where his car was parked on 2nd Street SE, got into his vehicle, and drove to his office at DIA headquarters in Arlington. The FBI's surveillance of Garrett over the following weeks was extensive and methodical. Agents obtained authorization to monitor his phone calls, conducted physical surveillance of his movements, and initiated a detailed review of his employment history, financial records, and access to classified materials. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had been living a double life for 7 years with remarkable discipline. There were no obvious signs of wealth or unusual spending. His lifestyle had remained consistent with his salary. His work performance had been solid but not exceptional. He had not attracted attention from colleagues or superiors. He had passed periodic security reviews without difficulty. But there were anomalies visible only under intense scrutiny. Bank records showed regular deposits of cash that Garrett had claimed on his tax returns as income from consulting work, a claim that was vague enough not to raise flags during routine audits. Records of document access showed that Garrett had been reviewing classified materials that were not strictly necessary for his immediate assignments, not unusual for a senior analyst conducting background research, but suggestive in retrospect. And the FBI's review of previous surveillance footage revealed that the unidentified American male who had been observed meeting with Volkov on 2 earlier occasions was, in fact, Garrett. The decision about when and how to arrest Garrett involved complex considerations. From a counterintelligence perspective, there was value in continuing surveillance to document additional meetings, identify other possible contacts, and understand the full scope of what he had compromised. But there was also risk. Every day that Garrett remained free was another day he could provide classified material to Soviet intelligence, and there was the possibility that he might detect the surveillance and either flee or destroy evidence. The FBI decided to move quickly. On November 29, 1979, at approximately 7:15 a.m., Special Agents Robert Chen and Margaret Hernandez, accompanied by 4 other agents, arrived at Garrett's home in Arlington. Garrett answered the door in his bathrobe. His wife and children were still asleep upstairs. The agents identified themselves, informed Garrett that he was under arrest for espionage, and advised him of his rights. His response, as documented in the arrest report, was notable for its lack of surprise. He asked if he could get dressed before being taken into custody. The agents agreed, with one agent accompanying him to his bedroom. He did not resist. He did not attempt to destroy any evidence. He did not make any phone calls or try to alert anyone. He simply got dressed, kissed his still sleeping wife on the forehead, and allowed himself to be escorted to a waiting vehicle. The search of Garrett's home, conducted over the next 8 hours, yielded significant evidence. Agents discovered a 35mm camera hidden in a storage box in the basement, along with several rolls of undeveloped film that, when processed, revealed photographs of classified documents. Agents also found approximately $37,000 in cash hidden in various locations, in shoeboxes in the closet, in a locked box in the garage, in an envelope taped to the underside of a desk drawer in his study. This represented the portion of his compensation he had not yet integrated into the family finances. A review of his home office revealed handwritten notes that appeared to be summaries of classified intelligence reports, along with a list of what investigators believed were signal sites, specific locations where Garrett would check for marks, indicating that a meeting with his handler was scheduled. Garrett's interrogation, which began that afternoon at FBI headquarters in Washington, was lengthy and oddly cooperative. He did not immediately confess, but nor did he maintain complete denial. He acknowledged that he had been meeting with Soviet intelligence officers. He acknowledged that he had provided information, but he characterized what he had done in ways that suggested he had not fully confronted the reality of his actions. He insisted that he had been selective about what he shared, that he had not provided information that would put American lives at risk, that his motivation had been primarily ideological rather than financial. The interrogation continued over several days, with FBI agents and Justice Department prosecutors carefully building their case. Garrett was shown photographs from the surveillance operation, including images of himself exchanging briefcases with Volkov at the Library of Congress. He was confronted with the classified documents found in his home. He was presented with evidence of his meetings with Soviet intelligence officers dating back to 1972. Gradually, his initial rationalizations gave way to a more detailed confession. He provided names, dates, locations. He described the signal system, the dead drop sites, the protocols for meetings. He admitted that over 7 years he had photographed and provided to Soviet intelligence more than 200 classified documents, including top-secret intelligence assessments, operational plans, and information about American surveillance capabilities. The damage assessment conducted by the Defense Intelligence Agency concluded that the information Garrett had provided had significantly compromised American intelligence operations and had given Soviet military planners insights into American assessments of Soviet capabilities that would take years to overcome. Several ongoing operations had to be terminated because Garrett had provided information that could have allowed the Soviets to identify sources or methods. The intelligence value of certain collection systems had been degraded because Garrett had revealed what the systems were capable of detecting. And the broader trust within the intelligence community had been shaken by the revelation that a senior analyst with a security clearance and access to highly sensitive materials had been operating as a Soviet asset for 7 years without detection. Viktor Volkov, meanwhile, had left the United States on November 30th, 1979, one day after Garrett's arrest. Diplomatic records show he departed on a scheduled Aeroflot flight from New York to Moscow, traveling with his wife, Irina, and their 2 daughters. The FBI had considered attempting to detain or expel him, but the Justice Department determined that doing so would accomplish little. Volkov had diplomatic immunity. He could not be prosecuted in the United States, and his departure was consistent with standard Soviet intelligence procedure. When an asset was compromised, the handler would be extracted quickly to avoid complications. Volkov returned to Moscow and, intelligence reports later indicated, continued his career in the KGB, eventually retiring in 1991, shortly before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He died in Moscow in 2003 at the age of 71, having never publicly discussed his intelligence work. The legal proceedings against Thomas Garrett moved relatively quickly. He was formally indicted on December 21, 1979, on charges including conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized disclosure of classified information to a foreign government, and multiple counts of violating the Espionage Act of 1917. The indictment laid out in 47 pages the full scope of what Garrett had done the damage he had caused, and the evidence the government had collected. The case was assigned to Judge Harold Brennan in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, a venue known for handling sensitive national security cases and for juries that were generally sympathetic to government prosecutors in espionage trials. Garrett's attorney, a public defender named Michael Stern, who had limited experience with espionage cases, initially explored the possibility of mounting a defense based on selective prosecution or on challenging the admissibility of some of the surveillance evidence. But the reality was that the evidence against Garrett was overwhelming. The surveillance photographs, the classified documents found in his home, his own admissions during interrogation, the testimony of FBI agents who had observed him meeting with known Soviet intelligence officers. There was no realistic prospect of acquittal at trial. On March 14, 1980, in a hearing that lasted less than 30 minutes, Garrett entered a guilty plea to the espionage charges in exchange for the government agreeing not to seek the death penalty. Judge Brennan accepted the plea and scheduled a sentencing hearing for May 1980. The sentencing hearing, held on May 8, 1980, provided a forum for both sides to present their arguments about appropriate punishment. Federal prosecutors emphasized the severity of Garrett's betrayal, the damage to national security, and the need for deterrence. They presented testimony from intelligence officials about specific operations that had been compromised and the lasting impact on American intelligence capabilities. They argued for a sentence that would reflect the seriousness of his crimes and send a message to anyone else who might consider similar betrayals. Garrett's attorney presented a more sympathetic picture. He emphasized Garrett's cooperation with investigators, his expression of remorse, his lack of prior criminal history, and his service to his country during the Korean War. He presented letters from family members attesting to Garrett's character. He argued that while Garrett's actions were wrong, they had been motivated not by greed, but by a misguided belief that he was serving a larger purpose. He asked the court to consider a sentence that, while substantial, would at least leave Garrett with some possibility of eventually returning to his family. Garrett himself was given the opportunity to address the court. The transcript shows he spoke for approximately 7 minutes. He apologized to his family, to his colleagues, and to the country. He acknowledged that what he had done was wrong and that his rationalizations had been self-serving. He said that he had spent the months since his arrest trying to understand how he had convinced himself that providing classified information to a foreign government could be justified. Each step down that path had involved him telling himself a lie. First, that he was only providing general background, then that he was being selective, then that the material wasn't really that sensitive, then that the Soviets probably already knew most of it anyway. He said he understood that he had betrayed the trust placed in him, and that no sentence the court could impose would be as severe as the knowledge that he had damaged his country and destroyed his family. Judge Brennan listened to these statements and then delivered his own remarks before announcing the sentence. He said that espionage cases were among the most serious matters that came before the federal courts because they involved not just violations of law, but fundamental betrayals of the public trust. He said that people who accepted positions of responsibility in the intelligence community and who were given access to the nation's most sensitive secrets took on a sacred obligation to protect that information, and that Garrett had violated that obligation repeatedly over years. He acknowledged Garrett's cooperation and remorse, but said that the severity of his crimes and the damage he had caused required a substantial sentence. He sentenced Garrett to 35 years in federal prison, a sentence that, given Garrett's age of 52, meant that he would likely spend the remainder of his working life, and possibly the remainder of his life, incarcerated. The impact of Garrett's arrest and conviction on his family was devastating and immediate. His wife, Janet, learned of his arrest when FBI agents arrived at the house that November morning in 1979. She had not known about his espionage activities. In interviews she later gave to FBI agents, she said she had been aware that Tom had been earning some additional money from consulting work, but she had not questioned it closely. She had noticed that he sometimes seemed stressed or withdrawn, but she had attributed that to the pressures of his job. When the FBI agents told her why they were arresting her husband, her initial reaction was disbelief, followed by shock that persisted for weeks. The practical consequences were severe. Garrett's salary stopped immediately upon his arrest. Legal fees were substantial. The family's savings were quickly depleted. The cash found in the house was seized as evidence and, after Garrett's conviction, was forfeited to the government. Janet, who had been working part-time, was forced to find full-time employment to support herself and the 3 children. The house in Arlington went into foreclosure in 1981. The family moved into a smaller rental apartment in a less expensive neighborhood. But the financial hardship, difficult as it was arguably less damaging than the social and psychological impact. The Garrett family became, overnight, the family of a convicted spy. Their neighbors avoided them. Janet lost friendships she had maintained for years. The children, Thomas Jr., who was 17 at the time of his father's arrest, Elizabeth, who was 15, and Michael, who was 13, were subjected to harassment at school, ostracism by their peers, and the general stigma of being associated with a traitor. Thomas Jr., who had been planning to attend college in the fall of 1980, found that several of the schools that had initially accepted him rescinded their offers after his father's conviction. He ended up attending a local community college while living at home and working part-time to help support the family. Elizabeth, who had been a strong student and active in her high school's drama program, withdrew from most of her activities and became, her mother would later recall, increasingly isolated and depressed. She graduated from high school in 1982 but did not pursue college. Instead, she took a series of low-wage jobs and struggled with what would later be diagnosed as chronic depression and anxiety, conditions that her family believed were directly related to the trauma of her father's arrest and the social rejection that followed. Michael, the youngest, had perhaps the most difficult time. At 13, he was old enough to understand what his father had done, but young enough to still be deeply attached to him. The sudden loss of his father, combined with the shame and social consequences, fundamentally altered his adolescence. He became withdrawn, struggled academically, and developed behavioral problems that worried his mother and teachers. Janet visited her husband in prison regularly for the first several years after his incarceration. She brought the children with her when they were willing to go, though as they got older, they became less willing. Letters that Garrett wrote from prison indicate these visits were painful for everyone involved. The children would sit in the visiting room, uncomfortable in the institutional setting, struggling to find things to talk about with a father who was now serving a 35-year sentence for espionage. The conversations were stilted, awkward. Garrett would ask about school, about their lives, about their plans. They would give brief answers. Silence would fill the spaces between questions. After an hour, Janet would gather the children and they would leave, and Garrett would return to his cell, and the family would drive home, and everyone would carry the weight of what had been lost. By 1985, the visits had become less frequent. Thomas Jr. had moved out of the family apartment and was working full-time while taking night classes toward a business degree. He stopped visiting his father entirely, telling his mother that he needed to focus on building his own life and that maintaining contact with his father was too painful and complicated. Elizabeth visited occasionally, but found the experience increasingly distressing. Michael, who was then 19 and working while finishing delayed high school coursework, continued to visit for a while longer, but eventually he too stopped, unable to reconcile his love for his father with his anger at what his father had done and the consequences it had brought upon the family. Janet continued her visits alone. She never divorced Garrett, though friends encouraged her to consider it. In later interviews, she said she felt that abandoning him entirely would be a betrayal of the life they had built together, even though he had betrayed her in ways that were almost incomprehensible. She worked as an administrative assistant at a real estate office, earned enough to support herself modestly, and spent one Sunday per month driving to the federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania, where Garrett was incarcerated, to spend an hour with her husband. They would talk about the children, about practical matters, about anything except the reality of why he was there and what it had done to all of them. Inside the federal prison system, Garrett's experience was shaped significantly by the nature of his crime. Prisoners convicted of espionage occupy an unusual position in the prison hierarchy. They are not respected by other inmates the way that, for instance, some organized crime figures might be. But nor are they at the bottom of the hierarchy the way that child abusers or informants are. They exist in a kind of neutral zone, isolated, often placed in protective custody, not because they are in physical danger, but because prison officials prefer to keep espionage convicts separate from the general population for security reasons. Garrett spent most of his sentence in medium-security facilities with limited contact with other prisoners. He worked in the prison library for several years. He took correspondence courses in Russian history and literature, a choice that some observers found darkly ironic. Prison records note that his behavior was exemplary. He followed the rules, caused no problems, participated in available programs, and maintained a low profile. Psychologists who evaluated him periodically noted that he expressed genuine remorse for his actions and demonstrated insight into the rationalizations that had allowed him to convince himself that espionage was justified. But remorse and good behavior did not translate into early release. The federal sentencing guidelines for espionage were strict, and the political climate of the 1980s was not sympathetic to convicted spies. The Reagan administration took a hard line on espionage cases, emphasizing deterrence and rejecting the idea that cooperation with investigators or expressions of remorse should significantly reduce sentences for what were considered among the most serious crimes against the state. Garrett's appeals for sentence reduction were denied. His applications for parole were rejected. He remained in prison, serving his time, watching the years pass. The geopolitical context in which Garrett had committed his crimes underwent dramatic changes during his incarceration. The Cold War, which had defined the ideological and strategic landscape during the time Garrett had been passing classified information to Soviet intelligence, began to thaw in the mid-1980s. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika opened up Soviet society in ways that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991. The ideological conflict that had supposedly motivated Garrett's espionage, his claimed belief that he was promoting understanding between two superpowers and preventing nuclear conflict, became, in retrospect, even more hollow than it had seemed at the time of his trial. By the mid-1990s, Garrett had been in prison for more than 15 years. He was approaching 70 years old. His health, which had been generally good, was beginning to decline. He had developed heart disease, diabetes, and the various ailments that accompany aging in a prison environment. His wife still visited, though less frequently than before. Her own health was failing, and the drive to Pennsylvania had become physically difficult for her. Their children had built lives of their own, complicated lives marked by the continuing shadow of their father's crimes. Thomas Jr. had eventually completed his college education, married, and was working as a mid-level manager at a logistics company in Ohio. He had changed his last name to his mother's maiden name in 1988, a decision made partly to escape the association with his father's conviction and partly as a symbolic severing of that relationship. He had not visited his father in prison since 1985 and had not spoken to him on the phone since the early 1990s. He had 2 children of his own and had made a conscious decision not to tell them about their grandfather's history, preferring to let them believe that their grandfather had died when their father was young. Elizabeth had struggled more persistently with the aftermath of her father's arrest. She had married briefly in her late 20s, but divorced after 3 years. She worked a series of administrative and clerical jobs, never settling into a stable career. She had periods of depression severe enough to require medication and therapy. She rarely spoke about her father, even to people she was close to, and when she did, it was with a mixture of sadness, anger, and confusion. She could not reconcile the father she had known as a child, who had read to her at bedtime, who had taught her to ride a bike, who had seemed like a normal, caring parent, with the man who had betrayed his country for money and ideology and had destroyed his family in the process. Michael, the youngest, had perhaps traveled the longest distance from the trauma of 1979. After graduating from high school, he had enlisted in the Army, partly out of a need to prove that he was not his father, that he was loyal, that the betrayal did not define him. He had served for 8 years, including a deployment during the First Gulf War, and had left the military with an honorable discharge and a sense that he had earned the right to his own identity. He had used the GI Bill to attend college, had earned a degree in engineering, and by the mid-1990s was working for a defense contractor in California. Like his brother, he had distanced himself from his father, though he maintained occasional contact with his mother. He had not visited his father in prison since 1990. In 1998, after serving 19 years of his 35-year sentence, Thomas Garrett's application for compassionate release, based on his deteriorating health, was approved. He was 71 years old. His cardiovascular problems had progressed to the point where prison doctors believed he had perhaps 2 to 3 years of life remaining. The Bureau of Prisons determined that he no longer posed a threat to national security. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union no longer existed. And the classified information he had compromised nearly 2 decades earlier was largely obsolete. On August 14, 1998, Garrett was released from federal custody and transported to a halfway house in Maryland, where he would spend the remainder of his sentence under supervision. His release attracted minimal media attention. There was a brief article in the Washington Post noting that a former Defense Intelligence Agency analyst, convicted of espionage in 1980, had been released on compassionate grounds. But it was buried on page A17 and generated no follow-up coverage. The Cold War espionage cases that had seemed so urgent and dramatic in the late 1970s and early 1980s had faded from public consciousness. The world had moved on. New threats, new scandals, new crises had replaced the old ones. Janet Garrett picked up her husband from the halfway house in September 1998 and brought him to a small apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland, that she had rented for them. It was a 1-bedroom unit in a modest complex, nothing like the house they had owned in Arlington before his arrest. Tom was frail, dependent on multiple medications, and required assistance with many daily activities. Janet, who was herself 69 and dealing with her own health problems, became his primary caregiver. The reunion with their children was limited and painful. Thomas Jr. declined to visit or speak with his father. Elizabeth came to the apartment once, in October 1998, and spent an awkward hour trying to make conversation before leaving with a promise to visit again that she never kept. Michael visited twice, including once with his wife, and tried to find some way to connect with the man who was his father, but who felt like a stranger. The conversations circled around safe topics: Michael's work, his own children, sports, the weather, and avoided the central reality that all of them were thinking about, but no one wanted to directly address. Thomas Garrett died on March 3, 2001, at the age of 73, in a hospital in Silver Spring after suffering a massive heart attack. Janet was with him. None of his children were. A small funeral service was held at a funeral home in Maryland. Janet attended, Elizabeth attended, Michael attended. Thomas Jr. did not. There were no other mourners, no former colleagues from the Defense Intelligence Agency, no friends from the neighborhood where they had lived in the 1970s. No representative from any organization, just a widow and two of her 3 children saying goodbye to a man who had destroyed his life and theirs through decisions that he had spent 2 decades trying to understand and had died without ever fully reconciling. Janet Garrett lived for another 6 years after her husband's death. She died in 2007 at the age of 78. Having spent the final decades of her life dealing with the consequences of choices that someone else had made. Her children inherited very little: a small life insurance policy, some modest personal effects, and the complicated legacy of being the children of a convicted spy. Viktor Volkov, who had been Thomas Garrett's handler during the critical years of 1976 to 1979, lived a very different kind of life after his departure from the United States. He returned to Moscow, continued his career in the KGB's first chief directorate, and eventually retired with honors in 1991. Interviews that Russian journalists conducted with former KGB officers after the dissolution of the Soviet Union indicate that Volkov was regarded as a skilled and successful intelligence officer who had managed several valuable American assets during his career. The loss of Garrett was considered an operational setback, but not a failure on Volkov's part. The asset had been productive for 7 years. The material obtained had been valuable, and the exposure had come through routine FBI surveillance rather than through any mistake Volkov had made. Volkov lived comfortably in retirement in Moscow with his wife. His daughters, who had been teenagers when the family left New York in 1979, both attended university, married, and had families of their own. Volkov was reportedly proud of his service to the Soviet Union and later to Russia, though he rarely spoke publicly about his intelligence work. He maintained friendships with other retired intelligence officers and was occasionally consulted by historians and journalists working on books about Cold War espionage. He died in 2003. Having never expressed any regret about the operations he had run or the lives that had been destroyed in service to those operations. The contrast between Garrett's fate and Volkov's fate is stark and speaks to one of the fundamental asymmetries of Cold War espionage. Garrett, the asset, paid the full price of his betrayal. 19 years in prison, the destruction of his family, social stigma, and eventual death, still carrying the weight of his crimes. Volkov, the handler, returned home to honors, a successful career, a comfortable retirement, and a family unburdened by shame. From the Soviet perspective, this asymmetry was simply the nature of intelligence operations. Assets were expendable. Officers were professionals doing their jobs. From the American perspective, it was a reminder that espionage was not a game or an intellectual exercise, but a serious business with real victims and lasting consequences. The broader impact of the Garrett case on American counterintelligence procedures was significant, but not revolutionary. The FBI had already been conducting surveillance operations against Soviet intelligence officers, and the successful identification and arrest of Garrett through such surveillance validated the approach. The Defense Intelligence Agency and other agencies with access to classified information implemented additional security measures, enhanced vetting procedures, and increased emphasis on monitoring access to sensitive materials. But no system could entirely eliminate the risk of insider threats. As long as human beings with access to secrets also had personal vulnerabilities, financial problems, ideological sympathies, resentment, psychological weaknesses, there would be the possibility of recruitment and betrayal. The case also contributed to ongoing debates about sentencing in espionage cases. Some argued that 35 years was too harsh for someone who had cooperated with investigators and expressed remorse, particularly when the damage, while significant, had not resulted in direct loss of life. Others argued that 35 years was, if anything, too lenient, and that people who betrayed their country's secrets should face the death penalty, regardless of whether those secrets led to immediate casualties. These debates would continue through subsequent espionage cases in the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond, with no clear consensus emerging about what constituted appropriate punishment for crimes that involved abstract harm to national security rather than concrete. Visible victims. For the FBI agents who had worked the case, particularly Special Agents Robert Chen and Margaret Hernandez, who had conducted the surveillance operation at the Library of Congress on October 17, 1979. The Garrett investigation was considered a significant success. Both agents received commendations for their work. Chen later served as a supervisor in the FBI's Counterintelligence Division and was involved in several other high-profile espionage investigations during the 1980s. He retired in 1995 after 28 years with the Bureau. Hernandez continued working counterintelligence cases throughout the 1980s and 1990s and was eventually promoted to a senior position in the FBI's Washington field office. She retired in 2001. In interviews both gave to researchers and journalists in later years, they spoke about the Garrett case as an example of patient, methodical investigation that paid off with a solid conviction. Neither expressed any particular satisfaction in the human cost: the destroyed family, the children whose lives were disrupted, the wife who spent years visiting her imprisoned husband, but both maintained that the arrest and prosecution were necessary to protect national security and to deter others from similar betrayals. The question of responsibility in cases like Thomas Garrett's is complicated because it requires us to distribute blame among individuals who were all to some degree acting according to the logic of their respective systems. Garrett made a choice in 1972 to begin providing information to Soviet intelligence. That choice was his own, made by an adult with full knowledge that what he was doing was illegal and wrong. The rationalizations he offered himself, that he was promoting understanding, that he was being selective, that he wasn't really causing harm, were self-serving and dishonest. He was responsible for his actions. But he was also the product of a system that had placed him in a position of access to sensitive information, had failed to adequately monitor or support him despite clear signs of financial stress, and had created a culture in which people could rationalize betrayal as idealism. The Soviet intelligence services that recruited him, trained him, and ran him as an asset for 7 years bore responsibility for exploiting his vulnerabilities and turning him into a tool of their operations. Viktor Volkov and the other KGB officers who managed Garrett's case were not neutral observers or passive recipients of information. They were active participants in his betrayal, even if they never faced any consequences for it. And then there are the victims who had no agency at all in what happened. Janet Garrett did not choose to marry a spy. Thomas Jr., Elizabeth, and Michael did not choose to be the children of a traitor. They were innocent bystanders to decisions that destroyed their lives, and no system of justice adequately compensates people in their position. The financial hardship, the social stigma, the psychological trauma. These consequences were not punishments for crimes they committed, but collateral damage from crimes committed by someone they loved. The Defense Intelligence Agency analysts whose work was compromised by Garrett's espionage, the intelligence sources whose identities may have been exposed or whose security may have been jeopardized, the broader American intelligence community whose trust was damaged, these too were victims, though their injuries were more abstract and diffuse. National security is not a tangible thing that can be weighed or measured, and harm to national security does not manifest in the immediate, visible ways that physical violence or theft does. But it is real nonetheless, and the cost of that harm is borne not by any single individual, but by the society as a whole. Thomas Garrett was 52 years old when he was arrested in November 1979. He was 71 when he was released from prison in 1998. He was 73 when he died in 2001. In between, he lost everything: his career, his freedom, his family, his reputation, his place in the world. Whether that loss constitutes justice or merely consequences, whether his punishment was appropriate or excessive, whether his remorse was genuine or self-serving, these are questions without clear answers. What is clear is that espionage, which is often portrayed in popular culture as glamorous or exciting or morally ambiguous in interesting ways, is in reality a brutal business that destroys people and leaves wreckage that persists across decades. The briefcase exchange that occurred at the Library of Congress on the morning of October 17, 1979, lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Viktor Volkov placed his briefcase on the floor next to his chair. Thomas Garrett, sitting nearby, placed his own briefcase on the floor. After several minutes, each man picked up the other's briefcase and left. The exchange was smooth, practiced, unremarkable to anyone who wasn't watching specifically for it. But that brief moment was the culmination of 7 years of betrayal and the beginning of consequences that would ripple forward through decades, affecting dozens of people, most of whom had no idea on that October morning that their lives were about to change forever. The photographs taken that day are stored now in classified archives, part of the permanent record of American counterintelligence operations. The people in those photographs are mostly gone now. But the questions their actions raised about loyalty, betrayal, responsibility, and justice remain as relevant and unresolved as they were on that morning in 1979.